As the global trade war launched by Donald Trump at the start of his presidential term continues to rage, a recent offer to Canada from the Chinese government through their ambassador to the Canadian government could be the start of a major turn. A little over a year before the release of this video, in alignment with the then-in-power Biden administration, Canada imposed a punitive tariff on the import of Chinese electric vehicles. It counts as a punitive tariff because rather than a revenue tariff imposed to bring in government revenue, or a low protective tariff intended to bring foreign import costs in line with domestic production, this tariff was so high as to make the consumer import of Chinese electric cars essentially infeasible. At the time, putting aside the wisdom of the strategy generally, for now, the rationale behind the tariff made some sense. Electric vehicles are positioned to be the future of the automobile sector, and Canada and the United States' own automobile industry is, or at least was, deeply interlinked. Instead of allowing consumers to get used to the import of Chinese vehicles, North American car manufacturers would be able to receive the domestic electric vehicle demand without having to face cheaper Chinese imports as competition. Now, of course, this does absolutely nothing for the global competitiveness of these vehicles outside of their North American tariff playground. An example of why tariffs are a pretty stupid way to go about industrial policy, unless your actual aim is giving a kickback to domestic producers, knowing full well you've actually made the situation worse by training domestic industry in uncompetitive practices at the expense of higher prices for consumers. In any case, with the arrival of the Trump administration, the nitwit logic of tariffs have made a turn towards their logical conclusion, with that administration making tariff threats and policies aimed at Canada with the purpose of, among other things, turning the North American auto industry into just the American auto industry. All of a sudden, the punitive tariff on Chinese electric vehicles are no longer a benefit to the automobile sector at the cost of everyone else, but just costs with no reliable benefit to anyone. Which is why this Chinese offer to the Canadian government and this punitive tariff is so intriguing, because it's essentially an offer to the Canadian economy to stop hurting itself in exchange for China giving it something else. That something else being a dropping of Chinese tariffs on Canadian agricultural goods, specifically seafood, peas, pork, canola oil, meal, and seeds. This would be happening at a time when the United States agricultural industry is getting hit hard by a variety of retaliatory tariffs implemented by China as a consequence of Trump's trade war, making this an excellent opportunity for Canada to wedge its way in to some of the market space left by the United States. While it is unclear whether or not the federal government of Canada will go along with this offer or use it as a starting point for negotiations, the position of provincial premiers is already becoming clear. Both the Premier of Saskatchewan, representing the right of the Canadian political spectrum, and the Premier of Manitoba, representing the left of the Canadian political spectrum, have signaled support for such an agreement. A basic adherence to the logic of free trade, in which costs for all as a whole are lowest when trade flows unrestrained due to everyone focusing on producing what they produce best, suggests that such an agreement would be a good deal for both sides and especially for Canada. A look at the fact that the Trump administration's shift of the United States' tariff strategy suggests that the logic of these electric vehicle tariffs was now essentially obsolete, also suggests that this is a good deal. Then there is the reality that as an at best middle-sized nation, Canada's only hope for building a strong trade position is playing off China and the United States against each other, makes this also clearly a very good deal. But before wrapping things up, I'd like to insert an additional consideration. Yes, there's a certain stigma to the idea that a developed nation should rely on others for the production of advanced manufacturing goods, while sending back agricultural goods that are lower on the value chain, but it isn't really a bad position at all. Every good that a country imports is a good that it doesn't have to use its own domestic resources of material and energy and labor to produce. Of course, you can't import without limits, and unless you have an extensively globally traded currency like the US dollar, or are a major hub of foreign investment, imports you make have to be at least partially counterbalanced by exports in order to prevent your currency value collapsing. So why not produce and export agricultural goods, which you need to produce to maintain a secure domestic food supply anyway and are definitionally renewable, rather than send products that use materials that are certainly not renewable, like the rare earth elements in batteries, to other countries for them to consume, especially if it means that if instead of dedicating workers to manufacturing such products, they can work in the service and knowledge sector where they can produce completely intangible products for export that have essentially no inputs aside from that which is needed to maintain workers and their equipment. In past centuries, states became obsessed with how to amass and retain gold within their realm through the policy of mercantilism, but that faded away as it became increasingly clear that the wealth of nations was not in gold, but in the production of what that gold was used to buy. It's a topic worth its own video, but perhaps the future of industrial strategy is how to stockpile the non-renewable and export the renewable. But you don't need any unconventional views of economic strategizing to come to the conclusion that Canada would be well served by axing its electric vehicle tariffs in exchange for China dropping their tariffs on Canadian agricultural goods. Thanks for watching to the end. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment.